Okay, so we got the recording going. Thank you. Yeah, I really appreciate that, John. Nothing like being 54 and spacing. Yeah, I get more absent-minded as my professorship goes on. All right, so what I want to do today is think about the colonial period and try and come to some kind of conclusion either today or next week on Tuesday as we're talking about this. And I'd like, as you can see on the board, I'd like to look at three various ways of approaching the colonial frontier. So the Spanish, and then the French, and then the English, and that'll lead us up to the American Revolution and the colonial experience, especially with the French and Indian War. But before we get to that, I want to kind of sum up what we talked about with the Columbian Exchange. So you remember a week ago, as we were talking about the Columbian Exchange, we were going through the various kinds of forces, for lack of a better term, that shape who and what we are as a frontier. And we talked about weeds or crops, we talked about animals, and we talked about the disease factor and the disease frontier. One of the things that I didn't note, but I should have, and I think is very important, is that there are these creations, starting with the Columbian Exchange, of what we call neo-Europes. So Europes with new at the front of it, neo-Europes. And you can imagine that when these great powers, and the Swedes and the Dutch as well, that when they're colonializing the world, they would have gladly have taken over everything if they could have. But what's odd is that when we look at the countries today, look at a colony like India, which of course is no longer a British colony, but was a British colony for hundreds of years, India still looks like India. It looks like India, even though it's modernized, it still has the quality of being Indian in the old traditional sense. And certainly Christianity, even though it's made great inroads into India, has never replaced the dominant system of Hinduism there. Nor does it look like that's going to happen anytime soon, especially with what's going on right now in Hindu revivals, huge Hindu revivalism, almost the equivalent of our Pentecostalism in America that's going on at Hindu Pride. And I bring this up because what we see is a place like North America has become a neo-Europe. That is, when we go to a place like Bismarck, North Dakota, none of us expect to see a Lakota Sioux Indian village there. We expect to see an English-style community. And that's the difference between North America and India. And so India is not a neo-Europe. North America is a neo-Europe. And when we think about the neo-Europes, so they're North America, they're southern Latin America. Not central and not northern South America, but southern South America. So a place, and we don't often think about this, but actually the single most European countries in the world in terms of European settlement are Uruguay and southern Argentina. Uruguay and southern Argentina are between 90 and 95% European, mostly Italian and German and Spanish. But still 90 to 95% European. That's stunning. In North America right now, at least in the United States, it's more so in Canada, but in the United States, we're about 75% European, with 25% minority in America. So we're obviously very European, but nothing compared to Uruguay or Argentina. Uruguay and Argentina are more European than even European countries, especially after all the Muslim immigration of the last 20 to 30 years, huge demographic shifts in Europe that you haven't seen in places like Argentina or Uruguay. So these kinds of places like North America, southern South America, Australia, New Zealand, these all look like European countries, but other places that Europeans tried to colonize, like Mexico, still look very Hispanic in the sense of not being Spanish, but being Mesoamerican, in terms of architecture, in terms of culture, sometimes even in terms of languages, especially in the Yucatan. You look at a place like India, it's still very traditionally Indian. You look at a place like China, it is still very traditionally Chinese, even though it's modernized. Right? Modernity doesn't really have much to do with this. There's a Chinese modernity and then there's a European modernity, and they're not quite the same. So anyone want to take a guess? Why is it that the Europeans are so successful in colonizing places like North America and making North America in the image of Europe, but a place like India doesn't work, even though, believe me, all of these guys would have loved to have done it. Ethan?
Does it have to do with just straight up like population and somewhat of like objectives wise too?
Okay. So how so? Explain that a little
like,
bit.
Well, largely like a lot of in North America, these ventures are set up as a sort of like either private ventures or for the sake of like extracting profit from that land, and so a lot of the settlements there are going to be more focused on that and on building infrastructure there, as opposed to say like India, where a lot of it is based around like exporting goods out of there, but also just, and of already like governing the structures that are already there. In North America, you have tribes that are a big presence, but they're not as like formidable as like the Mughal empires that were built off of an already existing.
Though you do have, and I'll give you a counterexample. This is a great point, Ethan. I appreciate it very much. But I'll give you a counterexample where Cortez definitely takes over the Aztec Empire as being the leader of the Aztec rather than crushing the Aztecs. Right? So, and we also see the disease factor, which is huge in a place like North America, but not in India. When the Europeans and the Indians meet each other, they don't really exchange diseases in the same way that the Europeans and the American Indians do. But yeah, your point is well taken. Yeah.
Does it have to do with population? Oh, Drew.
Drew, thanks.
Does it have to do with population density? Like the population density being lower in the countries that Europeans would eventually come to lead the population?
Maybe that's a good point. But you think of a place like Mexico. At the time of contact, Mexico probably had 25 million people, and 100 years later it only had 1 million people. So disease really ravaged. So there you have a dense population, but that population withers away because of disease. But I think that's another fine factor. Yeah. Sydney.
Does it have to do with like whether the climate and the soil or just the general environment were more
Talk about
similar?
that for a moment.
Is it that, like, I guess I'm not sure what South America is like, but it seems like if
Southern South America would look like Kansas.
Yeah.
Actually.
Anyway, like if America or North America is more like England's, for example, then it's easier to colonize and use the same equipment and start similar systems or civilizations.
Yeah, that's absolutely the answer. And all of these things that you brought up are definitely factors and play a role. But wherever the Europeans are successful in terms of remaking these places into their own image, it's because they had the exact same soil and environment. That is, they have the same climate, same rainfall. And that's, if you think about what happens in North America, when you look at the English, they settle mostly in New England and in the South, but of course in the South, they're not very good at right away, and so they have to import labor from elsewhere. And where do they import labor? They import labor from Africa, and not from Saharan Africa, but from sub-Saharan Africa. That is, they actually take people who were raised in a humid climate and move them to a humid climate, which, and I don't want to be environmentally determinist here, but it does matter. There's a reason slavery does not flourish in the North, and it flourishes in hot, humid areas. And the slaves come specifically from the hot, humid areas of Africa, not South Africa, which now looks extremely European and is a neo-Europe, but from Central Africa, not from North Africa, but specifically from Central Africa. And then you think about the European colonists. They march all the way to a place like St. Louis, and then they go to Kansas City, and then what do? They see these great plains. They have absolutely no idea what to do with them, and so they jump them. They cross them in the Rockies, and they end up in Oregon, in a place that's basically Europe on steroids. It's Europe with even better soil and even better rainfall. So wherever the English go, they are truly successful if they have the same climate and rainfall and have the same kinds of agricultural techniques that they can use there as they did at home. But they're not as successful in a place like India, which has a radically different environment, or China, at least the coasts of China, which have a radically different environment. But a place like Southern South America, it looks just like the Great Plains. And if you can do well in Kansas, which is going to take a bit, but if you can do well there, you can do well in Argentina. And think about what is, even in a place like Australia, what's been Europeanized? Only the coasts. The interior, the outback, is still truly wild. And Europeans don't know what to do with it. They don't know how to conquer it in the same way. So does this make sense for everyone? So I want us to understand that part of what the Europeans are doing, and they would have gladly taken over everything, but there are limitations to what they can do. And those limitations are still very present in the world today and the way that we see the dynamics of foreign policy. Okay, so unless there are questions on that, and thanks for jumping in on those thoughts, or with your thoughts on that, very good ones. So when we look at North America by 1713, we see a fairly divided North America, one that's divided roughly almost evenly between the Spanish control and the British control and the French control. The Spanish are always very interesting in the way that they settle. The Spanish have a strange settlement pattern in which they think that we call the Spanish frontier borderlands rather than calling it a frontier. You can call it a frontier, but it's a specific, when people talk about borderlands, they mean specifically the Spanish frontier. And the Spanish frontier was always based on this tension between God and gold. That is, the Spanish wanted to claim as much gold as possible, but the reason they wanted that gold was so that Spain could be the great nation to continue to defeat Islam, and as they hoped, to convert the Jews as well. And this was a very important aspect to Spanish culture. The Spanish, when they settle then, tend, as we just talked about a moment ago, they tend to try and dominate the Indian structures that they find. So when they move in, and most famously for us in this class, as my wife talked about, most famously when they move into what's now Mexico City, into Tenochtitlan, when they move into that city, they don't try and destroy the Aztecs. They try and conquer the Aztecs from the top down. That is, Cortez sees that this is a top-heavy empire, and that the goal is simply to replace Montezuma, and for Cortez to become the new Montezuma, rather than starting all over again. Now, some of you may know this. What Cortez is doing is totally illegal by Spanish law, and he is in fact a rebel, and he has to be controlled by the Spaniards because he's out of control, and here's some guy out on the frontier who's trying to make his own empire, which may actually rival the Spanish Empire. So the Spaniards actually sent a force against Cortez to stop him, and at one point during the siege, and the siege of the Aztecs lasts between about 1519 and 1522, but at one point during that siege, Cortez even has to fight his own men because they're in the middle of this rebellion against the Spanish Empire, as they're also taking on the Aztec Empire. And that's kind of a heart of darkness situation where you've got these people going in and being rogue. And of course, once Cortez gets everything and he's able to convince these people who are coming against him to be on his side, then he turns everything over to the Spanish Empire, and all is forgiven at that point. But nobody really knew what he was going to do, and that's not atypical for the Spanish. So we call the Spaniards who go in, especially the leaders of the Spaniards, who come in with these, basically what we might call militia groups, these small armies. We call them conquistadors. These guys who had come out of a situation, a very important situation, out of their own Spanish struggle against the Muslims, and they transferred that struggle to North America. So one very important thing, and Dr. Stewart could lecture circles around me on this, so if I say anything here that contradicts anything that Dr. Stewart has talked about in his Spanish history classes, don't hesitate to go with him rather than me. But what's interesting is we see that, of course, there was the Islamic takeover of Iberia starting about 711. That's one reason I can remember that date, because it's like a convenience store. But in 711, the Muslims start trying to take over Iberia, and they've conquered most of Iberia by roughly 716, 717. And they're left where you have the Spaniards and the Portuguese taken over by the Muslims. You're left with this one great moment about 717 where a group of Spaniards who have survived and have refused to convert, and they're up in the Pyrenees, they elect a king. And out of that king, and out of that moment in which they've elected a king, they very slowly reconquer Spain. And of course, when do they reconquer Spain? Not accidentally, it may be accidentally, but when it happens, they reconquer Spain in 1492. the exact same year that Columbus sails. So the idea that the Spaniards have some holy mission, especially since they finally drive all of the Muslims out of Iberia by 1492, is just obvious to a Spaniard that God is telling them, now that you've conquered the Muslims in this region, you have to go this direction to conquer Asia. And then once you've conquered and converted Asia, then you'll have the Muslims squeezed in between the Spaniards to the west of the Muslims and all the Asians to the east of the Muslims. And then you can take out the Muslims, convert the Jews, take over Jerusalem in a new crusade, and then proclaim Jerusalem to be the center of all Christendom in the world. So this is very important for these people, especially even though he's Italian. Christopher Columbus, and in his writings, it's amazing. In his writings, he actually predicts. He wrote a book called the Book of Prophecies, which was how he believed he was living out everything that Isaiah had said, and he believed he was the actual physical embodiment of Isaiah's, not of Isaiah, but of Isaiah's prophecy. And once he starts conquering the New World, of course Columbus believes he's in Asia, but once he starts conquering it, he believes that there's 155 years until the New Jerusalem arrives. Not 150, not 160, but exactly 155 years from now, the New Jerusalem will come down to earth and Christ will reign. But that means in that 155 years, you have to conquer the Muslims and you have to convert the Jews. And you have to take Jerusalem. And the only way you can take Jerusalem is if you have enough gold that you've earned in the New World, or this world that they discovered again. We don't know what's new until about 1506. But until then, they think that that's all of this they have to accomplish. Ethan.
So this kind of reminds me a lot of like millennialism in some
Totally.
ways. So
This
like,
is Catholic millennialism.
yeah, which I didn't expect. I thought that was kind of a Protestant phenomenon. So
Yeah, we're still even before the Reformation, right? We're at the end of Christendom in the sense of it being a unified Christendom. And yeah, but this millennialist drive is absolutely huge. So I'll read. I've given you a couple of quotes from Columbus, but I'll read some more here. Alex.
So, in popular culture and for the stuff that we read about the Spanish, it's like their love for gold. And were they able to find any substantial amount of gold to fund
They
their
did. They did actually. They were never able to get enough to retake Jerusalem. And part of it is you've got a king and queen who are very much in favor of retaking Jerusalem. You've got Ferdinand and Isabella. But once they're able to start solidifying their own position at home, and remember they have to be unified, right? They have to unify Iberia, and Portugal's already kind of gone off and done its own thing, and it's now competing with Spain. So once that happens, Ferdinand and Isabella get distracted, and they never do go for that conquest. But that mentality, that idea of conquering for God in order to get gold to retake Jerusalem, that will animate the Spanish all the way up until the 1750s. They're still thinking in terms of those conquistadors. I mean, these are guys who see themselves as being the hand of God against the enemies of Christendom. But the Asians, they think, are on the verge of converting. They always think that. So until we get to the New World, meaning until they understand it's a new world, which really is about 1506, is the first year that the Europeans start recognizing we're not in Asia, this is something different. But it did. Columbus comes in 1492. It takes 14 years for them to realize they definitely are still animated by that. Yeah, that was a great question. So I gave you a couple of, and by the way, I mean, this is, for the Spaniards, right, this whole thing is called the Reconquest, right, everything, whether it's in Iberia, or it's in North America or South America. This is all part of the Reconquest. So please know, I'm not trying to excuse the Spanish. They're brutal, they do horrible things, but in their doing those horrible things, they often were deeply motivated by Christian ideals, right or wrong. They were motivated by those things, and they're still living in a very medieval mindset, at least in terms of the Spanish medieval mindset. of what they need to do to recreate Christendom. But I gave you a couple of these quotes over the last couple of weeks, but I've never given them to you coherently. Right, here's what Columbus writes in his journal just prior to his first sailing across the ocean and his first voyage to discovering what is America, though again, Columbus never knows that. He thinks he's in Asia. So I saw the Moorish king come out of the gates of the city and kiss the royal hands of your highness. This was in the final defeat where Spain goes against the Muslims at Granada in January of 1492. And your highnesses as Catholic Christians took thought to send me, Christopher Columbus, to the said parts of India to see those princes and peoples and lands and the manner which should be used to bring about their conversion to our holy faith, and ordained that I should not go by land to the eastward, by which way it was the custom to go, but rather through wisdom to send me by the way of the west, by which down to this day we do not know certainly that anyone has passed. Therefore, having driven out all the Jews from your realms and the lordship in the same month of January, your highness has commanded me that, with a sufficient fleet, I should go to the said parts of India, and for this accorded me great rewards and ennobled me, so that from time henceforth I will be known as a Don. Right? He'll have basically the title of Sir, and be the High Admiral of the Ocean Sea, and the Viceroy, and the perpetual governor of the islands, and a continent which I should discover, and that my eldest son should succeed in the same position, and so on from generation to generation. So this is a creation of a Catholic dynasty as they see it. And when I say Catholic, I mean just Christian overall, because of the Protestants, unless we count Janus, but him aside, right, we generally have no Protestants at that point. So at the same time that the Spanish are conquering the Muslims, they also issue an edict that all the Jews within Spain have to either convert or leave. Right? And the Jews who refuse to convert are called Morinos. That's where Dr. Paul Mourinho, that's where his last name comes from. They were the ones who refused to convert and to become Christian. Paul's Catholic. I don't know when that happened, but somewhere along the way. So a lot of this was driven, and so I want to talk. Well, let me give you a couple more quotes before we move on. Here is Columbus right after this is right after his first voyage. During this time, I searched out and studied all kinds of texts. I've given you this quote before. All kinds of texts, geographies, histories, chronologies, philosophies, and other subjects, with a hand that could be felt, and the Lord opened my mind to the fact that it would be possible to sail from here to the Indies, and he opened my will to desire to accomplish this project. This is the fire that has burned within me since I first visited your highnesses. So that's not just rhetoric. Columbus really believes that he is acting according to God's will. Again, in 1500, he said, God made me the messenger of the new heavens and the new earth, of which he spoke of in his apocalypse to St. John, after having spoken of it by the mouth of Isaiah, and he showed me the spot where to find it. And then, in 1503, David in his will left 3,000 quintals of gold of the Indies to Solomon to build the temple. And according to Josephus, it was these same lands. Jerusalem and Mount Sion are to be rebuilt by the hands of a Christian. Who this is to be, God declares by the mouth of his prophet in the 14th Psalm. Abbot Joachim, and I'll talk about him in just a second, said that he had come from Spain. St. Jerome showed the way to it to Our Holy Lady. And the Emperor of China, sometime since, has sent wise men to instruct him in the faith of Christ. Who will offer himself for this work? If our Lord brings me back to Spain, I pledge myself in the name of God to bring him there safely. Right? So Columbus is absolutely driven by this. And this is where I want to talk about one of the orders that we haven't brought up at all in class. This is the Order of St. Francis, which is one of the largest orders, called the Franciscans, one of the largest orders in the Catholic Church. And I'll talk just briefly about who they are. But their main theorist was kind of a crazy guy, interesting monk, but a guy by the name of Joachim of Flora. Joachim de Flora. who, if any of you have ever read a lot of conservative theory, there's a guy named Eric Voegelin. Pretty interesting. Now you need to write this down. There's a guy named Eric Voegelin who claims that all of the modern world went wrong with Joachim before. Like if you want to find all communism, all fascism, everything that's gone wrong, it all started with this guy. And that seems to me to be a bit of an exaggeration, but I guess everybody needs their Antichrist. But Joachim was a pretty faithful monk, and his argument, and he did write all the time, he wrote as a mystic, and he wrote as a prophet. Well, let me back up. So the Order of St. Francis, these are the Franciscans. And the Franciscans are actually founded by St. Francis of Assisi. And a huge part of what they try to do is they try to preach the end of poverty and the end of war through peace. So if you have to find the specific Franciscan doctrine, it is this idea that we can find war and wealth in the best sense, not in the luxurious sense, but in the best sense, we can find that by pursuing peace. And I'm sure many of you have at least heard the prayer of St. Francis, Lord, make me an instrument of your peace. I mean, that's utterly Franciscan. And the Franciscans will be one of the two dominant orders that come to North America, the other being the Jesuits, which you saw a little bit in Black Grove, and then a third order called the Dominicans are important as well. But it's really the Franciscans and the Jesuits who are going to matter most. The Franciscans are almost always tied to the Spanish, and the Jesuits are almost always tied to the French, but both Roman Catholic orders. And so Joachim comes up with this theory as a kind of mystic and a prophet within the Franciscan order. He has this argument that there are three ages of mankind. There is the age of God the Father, there is the age of Jesus Christ the Son, and there is the age of the Holy Spirit. And this is it. There are only three ages. And at the end of the age of the Holy Spirit, the apocalypse will arrive. And everything that St. John saw in Revelation will come true, and there will be a new Jerusalem. I mean, this, Ethan, back to your question, this is pure millennialism. And they expect that the millennium will come very, very quickly. And this is everything to them. And so the Franciscans are absolutely urgent that this is going to sound really politically incorrect. I'm just speaking as they would have thought at the time. You're going to have a very good chance of converting the Jews. You're going to have no chance of converting the Muslims. So the Muslims can only be taken out. You're not going to go to war against the Jews. They're too spread out and they're in communities, but you can try and convert them. But the Muslims you have to conquer. And the Muslims have proven that in places like Spain, where they've been extremely militaristic. And so to respond to that, the Catholics will have to do exactly the same thing. But Joachim had believed, most importantly, that we had already entered the third age of man. That is, that we were entering the age of the Holy Ghost, as opposed to the age of Jesus Christ. So once the Middle Ages, it kind of rounded out, and I can't remember, for some reason in my mind, it's something like 12, well actually I think it's when St. Francis arises. He starts the age of the Holy Spirit, if I remember right, for Joachim, but I could be wrong on that. It's just kind of vaguely in my memory now. But Joachim is a huge influence, not just then on the Franciscans, but on all the Spanish, who of course remember have been in this 800-year war against the Muslims. And his prophecies really become important as they're moving to the New World. So even as late, as I said, as late as the 1750s, you have people animated by this. You have Spanish conquistadors as late as the 1750s still going on expeditions, trying to find certain things that will usher in New Jerusalem. So again, that millennialism is very strong among them. Yeah, Alex.
So millennialism is strong amongst the Spanish. Does it get any recognition by the Catholic Church itself?
You know, it does get some, but remember as well, so when we're talking about it, at the time Columbus is exploring, we have the single worst pope we've ever had in the papacy, right? It's Alexander VI, who's the pope at this time, right? The one that Machiavelli writes about and tries to put up. I mean, so you're at an absolute low point with the papacy at this point, as Columbus is exploring. So, the papacy is a factor, but it's only one factor, and what matters more, at least for Columbus, what matters more is that Ferdinand and Isabella are trying to become the spokesman for the Catholic Church as opposed to Alexander VI. And they presented themselves in a very holy fashion. And it is, I'll take this from Dr. Stewart. He understands this stuff far better than I do. But his argument is that there had been corruption in the Spanish Church, but by the time you get to Ferdinand and Isabella, they had pretty much wiped out all that corruption through the Inquisition. So the Inquisition had really driven out that corruption. And according to Dave, at least Dr. Stewart, England and Spain were the two least corrupt of the Catholic countries in all of Europe at that point. And from what I know, and also Dr. Smith makes that same argument when he looks at people like Sir Thomas More, that he doesn't argue on the Spanish, but he argues on the English being pretty free of corruption at that point. And I take those guys seriously. I think they're right about this from what my very limited perspective seems to be the case. Do you want to follow up?
Yeah. So this whole millennialism thing is the driving factor for the conquest of North America, at least in the Spanish idea.
Yes.
Does that appear in the other two?
Now they're happy to be an empire too, right? I don't want to cloud the idea that they're also just aggressive imperialists. They are, but they're imperialists with an idea, right? Okay, so I'm sorry, you're saying.
So does that millennialism influence the French or the English as well?
No, but we're going to switch to the French here in a moment. And what the French never had these millennial ideas in the same way that the Spanish do. But partly the French have a different history. They didn't just finish conquering their Islamic invaders after 800 years. They've been relatively safe because of what the Spanish have been doing. The Muslims would have gladly gone into France had they been able to, but of course they're stopped by the Spanish. And to a certain extent, French troops who help out at times as well. But they don't have that same drive. The English do have a bit of that after the Reformation. Once the English have their Protestant Reformation, they don't think in millennial terms in the same way that the Spanish do, but they definitely see themselves as countering the Spanish millennium. So we don't want the Spaniards from the English standpoint. We don't want the Spaniards to be able to expand and do any more with their kind of Catholicism. We have to fight it, and God has chosen us under Elizabeth I, the English see themselves as a chosen people, chosen to stop the Spanish. And that's one reason that the Great Armada, the fleet of 1588, the Spanish Armada, is wiped out by the English. It's called in England, it's called the Protestant wind, right? Because they see this as God's hand coming down and basically showing those Catholics what's what at that point. So it's more, the English are influenced by the millennium more by being anti-millennial than not, but it's still a factor for them because they're trying to stop the Spanish. Is that?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Okay, great. Anybody else? That is a great question. Thanks. Okay, so the Franciscans are going to drive a lot of this. Let me just show you a couple of things. I'm going to flash through real quick so don't get a seizure here. Okay. I'll show you this for a second. I wasn't going to do this. But when we look at claims on North America and claims on discovering the Americas, there were a few possibilities of people who had come to North America or South America prior to Columbus. And this gets really wrapped up in 19th century debates over which ethnicity is best. So the Italians and the Spanish will always say, oh no, Columbus was the first, he was the most important because he was sailing for Spain and he was Italian, and therefore he matters most. The Irish would often say, no, not at all. It was this guy, St. Brendan the Navigator, who was really the great figure. And chances are good St. Brendan actually probably did see the North American coast. Some of you may be familiar with Brendan. He is often considered the great saint of the Atlantic, and the Irish still very much remember him. He's still taken very seriously among the Irish. If any of you know John Miller, who's the head of the Dow journalism program, he named one of his sons Brendan after St. Brendan. And there's a great Tolkien poem as well about St. Brendan, and Brendan actually shows up in the larger Middle-earth mythology. But one possibility. Another definite is, of course, the Vikings landing in Nova Scotia, and this gives the Scandinavians now something to be proud of. right? This is really, so much of this is really wrapped up into 19th century ethnic rivalries, but true as well. And we get these remains here, these little mounds that were not mounds of the American Indians, but mounds from the Scandinavians that were left in places like Newfoundland. Then somebody brought up in class the other day, we were talking about why is it possible that many of the Indians had blue eyes, and there was this legend that had gone forth about a prince by the name of Prince Madoc, or Mad Dog, who had been a Welshman who had moved into North America and had settled in places like Indiana and had settled in the northern Great Plains. We have almost zero evidence for this. This one of all of these people, this one seems to be by far the least respectable of the theories who settled. But what matters most for us, of course, is Columbus. And his desire, of course, is his name. Even, just, anybody know what his name means? Christopher Colombo? Christopher means Christ bearer, and Colombo is the dove. Even that's just crazy when you think about his own millennialism, that it's tied to both Christ and Holy Spirit in some way. But Columbus, of course, makes 4 legendary voyages. But as we've talked about, the one that matters most for us is this 1493 voyage, because that's the one where he brought almost 2,000 colonists to North America, and that's the one that really inaugurates the whole Columbian exchange. We see all kinds of explorations going on. I told you guys we'd flash through these pretty quickly, but we see all kinds of explorations going on. It was this one here, led by Amerigo Vespucci, that really finally determined, or at least they made the very good educated guess, that this was not Asia, but it was the New World. And so rather than calling us Columbia, which would be proper to be named after Christopher Columbus, we're named after Amerigo Vespucci. That's where America comes from that exploration and his sailing from Spain into the New World. Now, I want to stop here for just a moment because this is, I think, a more interesting map. Once the Spanish realize that they are in this new world, they start exploring everything imaginable. Of course, one of the most famous that we won't deal with in this class is Pizarro's march into Latin America and his takeover of the Incan Empire, very similar to what Cortez had by taking over Tenochtitlan and the Aztec Empire. But I hope you guys see some of the religious things that come out of here. Where does Cortez land? He lands here, and he names the place Veracruz, the true cross. That's not accidental. And he believes that he is leading God's army to take out the Aztecs, especially the Aztecs being so absolutely brutal. But we also have all kinds of explorations into North America. Probably the most famous exploration was led by a man named Francisco Coronado. And Coronado was able to penetrate all the way to Santa Fe and then end up in central Kansas, a little town called Lindsborg, Kansas. Now, obviously, Lindsborg wasn't there at the time, but he was able to get all the way into the interior. But the Spanish are really trying to explore. So if you remember, it's only been about a half hour, but if you remember, I said the Spanish had a really unusual settlement pattern. What the Spanish do, and this will harm them in the long run, what the Spanish do is they try to take over important Indian centers like the Incan Center in Peru and the Aztec Center in Tenochtitlan in Mexico City. And then they hope to radiate power from each of those imperial centers. So rather than sending out families like the English do, the English always colonize 2 by 2, man and wife, going out, usually in community. And the English are very, very slow in their colonization of North America, but they're extremely steady. And once you have families in a certain place, it is very difficult to dislodge them. But the Spanish don't do that. The Spanish mostly have a male empire. And therefore, once they've taken over a center of empire, like Mexico City, they tend to project their power and radiate it by colonizing strategic points. So whereas the English just slowly keep having children and children and children and taking over the frontier family by family, the Spanish move very rapidly. And they'll see a place like Santa Fe, and they'll say, we need Santa Fe. And they'll put a military regiment there. They'll put a garrison there. They'll garrison Santa Fe and declare that to be the outer post. But there are over 1,000 miles between Mexico City and Santa Fe. And there's very little in between except the El Camino, the great road of the Spanish. So the Spanish are constantly projecting their empire by saying, there's a strategic spot, but they don't fill in the spaces of their borderlands. And they almost always intermarry with the natives, which is certainly not a problem. It's going to be very successful in the way that they intermarry with the natives, but it's very different than what the English do. Okay, any questions about the Spanish? If not, I want to move to the French. But any questions at all about the Spanish? One of the great Spaniards, guy by the name of Bartholomew de las Casas, who was absolutely instrumental in explaining the abuses of the American Indian to the Spanish monarchs and finally convincing the Pope. So we had a bad Pope with Alexander VI. We end up with a very good Pope, Paul III, who was also the same Pope who later, if you guys remember from Western Heritage, called the Council of Trent. Good guy in all kinds of ways. But here he decrees in 1537, based on the work of de las Casas, that the Indian must indeed be treated as a human being capable of eternal salvation, therefore endowed with free will and able to make those decisions. Incredible guy. Oh, there's Coronado. I forgot I had him. Looking interesting there. This is the guy who made it all the way into central Kansas earlier on. Really, if we had more time in this class, you could do an entire semester on Spanish exploration. These guys are fascinating as they move into the interior and try and figure out what they're doing and trying to negotiate with the Indians. There's again, apologies, I haven't looked at my PowerPoint for a while. There's a very good map of what Coronado was able to accomplish, getting all the way in. I mean, he goes to the Grand Canyon, he gets to Santa Fe, and then ends up in central Kansas before turning around. So really had seen much of the interior. Juan de Oñate, okay, I should mention him. Juan de Oñate, so after Coronado's expedition, as you can see here, was in 1540 to 1542. And it was considered such a disaster by the Spanish that they decided to put a moratorium on all exploration and colonization into the interior of North America for a certain amount of time. And it would take almost 50 years for someone to come up with a plan of conquering. And Juan de Oñate is at least someone, I think every educated person should know the name, but we're not going to talk much about him. But he is the one who begins to colonize New Mexico. So there had already been a garrison at Santa Fe, but it's de Oñate who moves Spanish colonists, and especially the Franciscans, into New Mexico and colonizes New Mexico. And that's where our modern New Mexico comes from. It comes from de Oñate's settlement. Michael.
Why was it considered such a failure?
Say that again.
Why was it considered such a failure?
Well, because it spent tons of money on the exploration. It was a huge exploration that Coronado had. And they had a priest with them who either was a fool or a liar. It's a guy by the name of Friar Marcos. And Marcos claimed that he had once been the captive of the Indians, and that while he had been the captive of the Indians, he had seen the 7 cities of gold. He had seen El Dorado. And so they believed him. And they believed there was an old legend that at the beginning of the Muslim conquest of Iberia, 7 priests or bishops had left to depart to keep the Christian faith. And the belief was that they had gone west. And the most important of these guys, you guys should probably know this, the most important of these priests was a guy named Prester John. And so Prester John or Praetor John, depending if you want to give him a more Roman name, Prester John had supposedly led these 7 bishops somewhere into the West to protect Catholicism, protect Christianity, and to create these kingdoms. And so each one of the 7 supposedly had founded a city of gold because of the vast gold that would be everywhere in North America. So Fray Marcos kept leading these people throughout North America, and they kept not seeing the 7 cities of gold. They obviously never found them, but that myth and that legend remains for a very long time. So yeah, go ahead, Michael.
Is this an expansion of the legend of Prester John in Asia and Ethiopia?
Yes. So that's also when Columbus is going, they believe that there are going to be these 7 Catholic bishops somewhere that exist somewhere in the West. So either they're going to be in the New World or they're going to be in Asia. And that's part of this mythology, strong mythology that keeps leading these people westward. Yeah. This stuff, you can't make this stuff up. Right? It's just as wild as it gets. But obviously no 7 cities of gold, right? Spoilers. But no 7 cities. Not that we've found yet. Okay, anything else on any of this? Okay, good. All right, well, let's jump to the French, and then we'll call it a day. So the French are obviously the other people who matter here in terms of settling North America. And I'll go forward here to that French map we had. Sorry, guys. There we go, the French map. So the French begin to settle early, and they have a kind of a similar situation to Coronado. So the French send a number of people into North America, and specifically the most important one is a guy named Jacques Cartier, who comes into North America and tries to colonize what will be later Quebec around 1534 through 1536. But it's very expensive, and nothing really happens. So it's almost 100 years later, so very similar. So we say the Spanish explore in the early 1500s, but they don't colonize until the early 1600s. The exact same thing is true of the French. The French are exploring in the early 1500s, but they're not able to colonize until the early 1600s. And this isn't that different than the English. The English explore North America in the early 1500s, but can't colonize, of course, until Jamestown in 1607. So there are really parallels going on between all 3 of these powers in terms of what they would like to be true and in terms of what is true. And I'm not exactly sure. I think it's just circumstances that leads to the early 1600s being that time of colonization. But it is fascinating that it takes them all roughly the same amount of time. But I want to read to you from a very famous history. This is from 1848, one of the most famous histories written about North America. And it's by a guy that everyone should know, Francis Parkman, one of the great historians and great writers of the 19th century, a Bostonian Brahmin, very elite. And he wrote this multi-volume history of France and North America. And his language here is very telling because it fits into, if you remember when we talked about mythology, it fits into the Black Legend and the idea of the Black Legend. And so he says, the springs of American civilization, unlike those of the elder world, lie revealed in the clear light of history. In appearance, they are feeble. In reality, copious and full of force. Acting at the sources of life, instruments otherwise weak become mighty for good and evil, and men lost elsewhere in the crowd suddenly stand forth as agents of destiny. In their toils, their sufferings, their conflicts, momentous questions are at stake and issues vital to the future world. The prevalence of races, the triumph of principles, health or disease, a blessing or a curse. On the obscure strife where men died by tens or scores hung questions as deep of an import for posterity as those mighty contests of national adolescence where carnage is reckoned by the thousands. So, importantly, you can have a Daniel Boone as a single figure really matter. You can have a small battle like the Battle of the Alamo where you have only 187 defenders really matter, as opposed to the kind of mass slaughter we'll see in Europe where it becomes so mass that it becomes almost anonymous. One of the things we know about the American frontier is that all of these people become larger than life because they tend to represent something much greater than themselves. Daniel Boone is not just Daniel Boone, he is the frontier. John Wayne is not just John Wayne, he is the American frontier. And that symbolism matters. Whereas in Europe, you might have 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 John Waynes fighting against 3,000 or 4,000 other John Waynes. In America, as individuals, they stand out, they signify something because of their symbolism. So the subject, Parkman continues, to which the proposed series will be devoted is that of France in the New World. That is, and here this is the critical part, it is the attempt of feudalism, monarchy, and Romanism, meaning the Roman Catholic Church, to master a continent where at this hour 500,000 bayonets are vindicating the ascendancy of a regulated freedom. Feudalism, still strong in life, though enveloped and overborne by newborn centralization. Monarchy in the flush of its triumphant power, and Rome, nerved by disaster, springing with renewed vitality from ashes and corruption, and ranging the world to reconquer abroad what she lost at home. Anybody catch that? Interesting language. What's Parkman think of the Catholic Church? Yeah, Alex.
Dying out, really.
Yeah. And if it's reviving at all, who else ranges the world seeking the room of souls? That's what Satan does, right? So this is not a positive view of the Catholic Church at all, right? This is a church of demons and a demonic understanding and trying to make that the world even.
Is he writing this in the middle of the 1848 revolutions? Or?
Yeah, it's 1848 revolutions. Yeah, and he's talking when he says 1,000 bayonets, he's talking about the Mexican War at this point here in America. So to continue here. Ranging the earth to reconquer abroad what she had lost at home. These banded powers, pushing into the wilderness their indomitable soldiers and devoted priests, unveiled the secrets of a barbarous continent, pierced the forests, traced and mapped out the streams, planted their emblems, built their forts, and claimed all as their own. New France was all at the head. Under king, noble, and Jesuit, the lank, lean body would not thrive. Even commerce wore the sword, decked itself with the badges of nobility, aspired to the forest, basically nobility, and hordes of savage retainers. Along the borders of the sea, an adverse power was strengthening and widening with slow but steadfast growth, full of blood and muscle, a body without a head. Each had its strength, each its weakness, each its own modes of vigorous life, but the one was fruitful, the other barren, the one instinct with hope, the other darkening with shadows of despair. By name, local position, and character, one of these communities of freemen stands forth as the most conspicuous representative of this antagonism. Liberty and absolutism were at war, or we could say New England and New France. New England being liberty, New France being despotism. The one was the offspring of a triumphant government, the other of an oppressed and fugitive people. The one, an unflinching champion of Roman Catholic reactionism, the other, a vanguard of Protestant reform. Each followed its natural laws of growth, and each came to its natural result. Vitalized by the principles of its foundation, the Puritan Commonwealth grew apace. New England was preeminently the land of material progress. Here the prize was within every man's reach. Patient industry need never doubt its reward. Nay, in defiance of the four Gospels, assiduously in pursuit of gain, was promoted to the rank of duty, and thrift and godliness were linked to equivocal wedlock. Politically, she was free. Socially, she suffered from that subtle and searching oppression which the dominant opinion of a free community may exercise over the members of a community that compose it. So this becomes the great struggle as Parkman sees it. The struggle between liberty and repression. The struggle between enlightenment and endarkenment. And that's exactly what Parkman presents, and yet he is really fascinated with the French as well. So here's what the French do, and you can kind of see it. This map isn't great, but it's pretty good. You can see what the French do. They are excellent explorers, and they are really good at moving down rivers. This is what they do. Anywhere there's a river in North America, the French have moved into that region, and they spread very, very quickly. It's mostly a male frontier. But what happens, so you get two people who are really representative of the French. You get the fur trapper, who is the great entrepreneur of the American frontier, and you get the Jesuit. These are the two, and you saw that when we watched Black Robe, and we didn't really watch this part, but if you've seen the whole movie, there's definitely a tension between the trappers and the priests. You saw that a little bit in the village when the priests walked by, those guys who were building things. But there was always a bit of a tension between those things. The French send roughly about 60,000 men to North America. They rarely send women at all. Women just do not colonize France, New France, but the men do. And as the men move into the interior of the country, they intermarry with the American Indians and intermarry into the American tribes. So what happens is you'll find a tribe like the Hurons or the Miamis of northern Indiana, lots of tribes in this region, that after a few generations, it is very difficult to know who in the village is actually French and who is Indian. There's been so much intermarriage between the French and the Indians. And the French have a term, I'd like you all to know, the French have a term they use for the people who are mixed descent, that is, those who are, the English will call them half-bloods or half-breeds, which is totally politically incorrect. But the French called them the people in between. They called them the Métis. This was the name of those who were French and Indian at the same time. And these people who were both French and Indian, these Métis, occupied a kind of middle ground, and they were always the most prestigious people within a tribe. And they became that. So France really intermarries very strongly with the local natives, and that becomes New France. New France is this empire that exists mostly because the local natives have consented to do so. So this is one way to think about if we're trying to compare the French and the English and the Spanish and their relations with the Indians. So it's very typical that the Spanish try to dominate the Indians. So they try to take over the Indians. They don't massacre them. You don't find a lot of massacres in Spanish history. But they try and dominate the Indians and control them and make them Spanish in some way or another. The French always intermarry and could care less if an Indian looks like an Indian or looks like a Frenchman. And the Métis typically would dress in a fashion, and they were pretty obvious. The Métis would typically dress wearing French clothing from the waist up and wearing buckskin from the waist down. So this was one way you could tell a Métis. Might have a calico shirt, but then wearing buckskin with it. And that actually became kind of frontier regalia as well, not just for the Métis, but that's how Daniel Boone dressed too. It becomes one way of living on the frontier. But there's so much intermarriage, and the French don't mind, that this is simply a part of their empire in New France. So the Spanish try to dominate, the French intermarry, the English push out of the way. So that's how they deal with the American. Now, that's a gross exaggeration. If we could spend a semester on this, we could get into the nuances of each of that. But that really is the best way to think of it. The Spanish dominate, the French intermarry, and the English push out of the way. So that becomes their modus operandi for dealing with the American Indian. But the French are very successful in taking over the Mississippi and all of the Mississippi tributaries as well. And they're able to do this. Now, let me talk about the other group of French. So the French fur trappers intermarry with the Indians, but then you have the Jesuits. And the Jesuits really matter as well because the Jesuits are helping determine what the culture is. So, you guys remember the scene in the movie where they're standing in front of the clock. This is from a Jesuit, an official Jesuit record. As to the clock, 1,000 things are said of it. They all think it is some living thing, for they cannot imagine how it sounds itself. And when it is going to strike, they look to see if we are all there, and if someone is not hidden in order to shake it. They think it hears, especially when, for a joke, one of our Frenchmen calls out at the last stroke of the hammer, "That's enough," and then it immediately becomes silent. They call it the captain of the day, and when it strikes, they say it is speaking. and they ask how, when they come to see how many of the times the captain has already spoken, they ask for us how we feed it. They remain for a whole hour and sometimes several in order to hear what it speaks. They used to ask at first what it said, and we told them two things that they had remembered very well. One, that when it sounded 4 o'clock in the afternoon during winter, it was saying, "Go out, go away, and close the door." And immediately they would rise and leave. The other, that at midday said, "Come put on the kettle." And this speech is better remembered than any other. So what happens, and I read this here more for whimsy than anything else, but what happens is that the Jesuits really shaped the relations between the Indians and the French in a variety of different ways. But they're the ones who bring Roman Catholicism into the Indian life. And it's one reason that throughout all of these areas, we have these Indians who have been Catholicized. So there's a very famous, you guys don't need to know his name now, we might talk about him later, but there was a very famous Baptist preacher, hardcore Baptist preacher by the name of Isaac McCoy. And he showed up in Michigan in the 1820s to evangelize the Indians. The Indians in this region had not had a priest for about 3 generations, but they still remembered their Catholicism. And so when Isaac McCoy went up to the Indians and he said, "I'm here to introduce you to Christianity," they said, "Oh no, we're already Christian," and started signing themselves, which really freaked out Isaac McCoy. He was not happy about that. But definitely that Catholicism lingers throughout this whole region. And even places, about a place like St. Louis, Little Rock, Arkansas, these were all French communities and very, very Catholic, and to this day remain relatively Catholic because of that French influence. But the Jesuits are really interesting. We've only got a couple of minutes left, so I'll finish with this. The Jesuits, as I mentioned the other day, when after we watched the movie, the Jesuits were really like the superheroes of their day. You couldn't become a Jesuit until you had earned the equivalent of a double PhD. This is one of the things that the Jesuits instituted. They're formed during the Reformation. They're formed a little bit, they are formed during the Reformation, but they're formed originally to convert the Muslims. But then that translates very quickly into trying to convert the Protestants as well. And this is one reason that the Jesuits are always considered the kind of boogeymen within the Catholic Church, especially for Protestants. What I have to tell you guys is my favorite professor at Notre Dame, the Notre Dame priest, Father McConnell, just an incredible guy. But he told me he was not a Jesuit, but he used to put on a Jesuit robe and stand out in front of his church because across the church was a Baptist church, and he would smoke in his robe as the Baptists were coming to service just to freak them out. He thought that was hilarious. The Jesuits are really the bad guys. They're great, but they're really the bad guys in the Reformation, depending on your point of view. And what the Jesuits do that's very interesting is, and you saw this a little bit in the movie, but not enough, the Jesuits never try and convert the Indians to the European way of life, only to Christianity. So the Jesuit philosophy is that the native way of life is perfectly fine. It may need changing. Maybe they commit infanticide, and that would need to change. But things like food customs and hunting customs and even war customs, that remains to the indigenous people themselves. And as long as they sanctify their culture by becoming Christian, they don't have to Europeanize. Franciscans wanted to Europeanize. Franciscans believed that when you meet the Indian, you make them European and Christian at the same time. The Jesuits said there's no reason to change their culture. In fact, there may be certain advantages to a native culture where they haven't become corrupt in certain ways that the West has. And therefore you focus only on the religion, and that's what you preach. But the Jesuits are very successful. They're incredibly successful. And one of the reasons they're successful is that the first guys who go in as the Jesuits are usually martyred. And they're taken out. So a Jesuit comes in, and one of the most common things that an American Indian tribe would do when you have a stranger in your village, a male stranger, you would offer them one of your wives for the night. And of course, the Jesuits couldn't do that. And so the Indians became convinced that the Jesuits were not men, but demons, because only a demon would not have that kind of urge or that kind of normal, we don't have to get into description there, but would have that. And so they usually kill him. But because he would die without screaming, and if any of you watched the rest of Black Robe, that was one of the most important. The priest is tortured, but he doesn't scream. If you don't scream, you prove that you have a true warrior spirit, and you're not a demon. And then the next Black Robe who comes in is welcomed because they think, we want this guy's power. And there's no question, they weren't thinking, we want to be saved by Jesus. They were thinking, these guys are powerful, and we want this power. Later, it became saved by Jesus. But the introduction to them is this power that they have, and especially the power to resist torture and to allow that and to die for that. Indians were absolutely fascinated by this. And so the first Jesuits are always martyrs. In fact, what is it, September 28th is in the Catholic Church is the feast of the Jesuit martyrs, specifically the feast of the North American Jesuit martyrs. There were a lot of them. Incredible guys. You have to, whatever, if you don't agree with their theology, you have to give them credit for what they believed and what they did. So, Alex, last point.
I was just going to ask about that. Like, you brought that up a couple classes ago about the first one always dies and the second one. I just wanted a further clarification about that.
Yeah, so those guys who went in, they knew. I mean, anyone who went in for the first time knew basically their life was forfeit. And part of Jesuit teaching was that you had to be willing to accept that. You don't seek it, but you have to be willing to accept it. And there's no way around that. So, yeah, the guy that this priest we saw in the movie was based on was actually, I mean, we'll end on this note. He was in Michigan. He made it into Michigan, and he was captured by Indians who tried to, not only did they try to kill him, but they actually sawed off all of his fingers. They sawed off his toes, and then started working on his arms until he bled out and died, but he never screamed. Pretty amazing guy. So, okay, on that happy note, God bless everybody. I'll see you on Thursday.